Hi, welcome again to Red Flags Rising. My name is Mike Hunnicky. I am the co-chair of the Sanctions, Export Controls, and AML practice at Hughes, Hubbard & Reed. With me, as always, is Brent Carlson, my good friend and a director at the Berkeley Research Group. Today is Thursday, July 17th, 2025. It is just after 4 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. Brent, how are you doing today?
Excellent, Mike. Great to be here as always.
So, Brent, there's a lot in the news, a lot going on. Where do you want to start today?
Well, the big news in the export control world, especially for the United States and China, is the permission now from the Trump administration to allow certain AI chips to be sold into China. I mean, that's huge news. Back in April, NVIDIA's H20 chip initially was going to be allowed and then it was banned. Now we're back to the US government allowing it, but now licenses need to be applied. That's an interesting twist. I mean, one of the things that you and I have talked about for a while is this larger debate on whether there should be any sales of high technology items with dual use applications into the PRC at all. You can see how there's both sides of this debate, but I think there's a middle way here. When we've talked about it, we have always been in the position where there should be some sales that can happen, but there needs to be full transparency and compliance with export controls. It's not just about the technological parameters, where it fits in terms of the ECCN on the Commerce Control List, but there are also end use and end user provisions of the EAR that require application of a license. That's where we're at. So this is an interesting balance today. I think that's big news for everybody. Again, I think there's a middle way here where government and industry can find a path where this middle way can address the concerns and objectives for both industry and government.
It's an amazing example of the highs and the lows of the roller coaster that not just trade compliance professionals, but boards, shareholders, C-suites have been on over the past couple of months. The whole ballad around some of these chips has been just quite remarkable, with reports that they were going to be allowed, that they weren't going to be allowed, right around the time of some reporting in NPR. Companies had to take huge hits on their financial statements to reflect the cost of things that were in production that couldn't be sold. Now we see and hear that there's an opportunity to sell. But yes, Brent, like you mentioned, we see there's a license application requirement, at least from what we've seen in the media about this. We should caveat, look, we're not directly involved in these cases. There are probably many facts that we don't know. This is an amazing case study, though, for anyone in any part of the tech stack. On the last episode, we talked about stack sweeps and the risk to anyone in the stack if some catch-all provisions are determined by the U.S. government to apply. We've seen in the reporting, at least on this, Brent, that when the Commerce Department in April blocked the sale of these items, it appeared to be because of a concern that the supercomputer catch-all provision applied. Sometimes you and I have talked about catch-all provisions that apply to paperclips, that apply to anything. In that particular catch-all provision, there's really two key parts to it. The first part is the integrated circuit, or the thing into which it's going, has to meet certain technological thresholds. If it doesn't meet those thresholds, then this catch-all would not apply. And then there has to be knowledge that the item is being sent for a prohibited or a restricted use. It appeared from the initial reporting that the U.S. government had taken a view in April that something about the sales was triggering a concern on the government's part that supercomputer definition was being met. It'll be really interesting to see then how now that plays out, because the government has signaled that it will allow those shipments, but with a license. Now, just because a catch-all provision applies doesn't mean you under no circumstances can ship it. The government can still exercise its discretion to grant you a license. A presumption of denial, under which many of these catch-all provisions operate, is not a rule of denial. So there may be national security reasons why they actually do grant some of these licenses. We saw previously, Brent, many years ago, that there were licenses still granted, for example, to Huawei for items that otherwise would appear to have not been allowed to go to them under the entity list, and the way that that was being used. So to quote Dumb and Dumber, you're saying there's a chance? There's always a chance, especially when it feeds into, as all of this does, Brent, everything we talk about feeds into the broader geopolitical discussion and the broader mega trends that are underway. I hope, for the sake of the trade compliance teams involved, that we don't hear the exact opposite in 2 weeks.
That's kind of the issue, right? That's really a concern for trade compliance teams and companies overall, because you need to protect yourself for a potential whipsaw effect. Export controls, number one, they are a pillar of national security, and that's here to stay. That's not going away. But the other development now is that export controls are part of these broader trade negotiations between the United States and China. Look, what can be okay one day may be taken away. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, and the Lord may give back again. We're in this situation where trade compliance teams and boards of directors in their duty of oversight are going to have to really be on top of their game on this to make sure that they don't get whipsawed if or when the policy changes, and all of a sudden they may be, to use the old Warren Buffett line, swimming naked when the tide goes out. So that's part of what we've been talking about, and we'll talk a little bit in this podcast about our new World ECR article. These things are not necessarily set in stone. We live in a world of uncertainty. The only certainty is uncertainty. How can we protect ourselves? How can all of us protect ourselves, protect our businesses, protect our people, protect our officers and directors from these vicissitudes that are going on? There's a way, there's a middle way, but it takes a whole lot of holistic thinking.
Maybe, Brent, another way to think about it, when we say to protect yourself from the whipsaw effect, it's not that you will ever be able to prevent the whipsaw. It's how do you stay grounded at the core during those violent movements back and forth. As we've said many times, we appreciate no one is living in a perfect world. This is not an ivory tower situation any of us are in, right? But ideally, you would anticipate, well, if the government starts to take a different view, sitting here today, what type of information should I gather now that if I don't gather now, later I will wish that I had? Because later it may be too late or later it may be too difficult. There's no better time than the present to ask those preliminary questions and to build the file that you might want to have to protect yourself later. The government didn't rescind the supercomputer end use or end user rule. There may be a slight loosening on the policy of denial in granting the licenses. That doesn't prevent the government from asking anyone involved 6 months from now, 12 months from now, whatever it might be, okay, well, what did you do from a due diligence perspective to determine whether this catch-all provision applied? And if there was a high probability that it was going to a supercomputer use, that's the type of case you want to build and document now so that you have it for when the question might come up later.
I think that's a great segue into talking a little bit about our article in World ECR magazine. That's World Export Control Review magazine that is now part of Dow Jones. The title is Anticipating the Moment of Truth, How to Prepare for High Probability Catch-all Enforcement. Why don't we talk a little bit about the background of this? Because this really came out of the May 13th guidance that the Bureau of Industry and Security issued when it put the pause on the AI diffusion rule. At the same time, it came out with these policy and guidance documents that really portend a shift in terms of thinking on the part of the Commerce Department in what they're expecting in terms of compliance and enforcement. So why don't we unpack that a little bit?
Well, Brent, the real reason this article is coming out, especially for the listeners keeping score at home, is that Tom Blass asked us for an article on this topic and we owed him one. So shout out to Tom and to Mark and everyone at World ECR, and thanks for, again, graciously throwing our work into your magazine. We really appreciate, as always, the opportunity to be part of that great community that we discussed on an earlier episode. Anytime guidance or policy comes out, Brent, there's a question about what do we need to take from this in terms of more broader issues and broader trends. This is a bit of a moment of truth to us, even more so than the July 10th, 2024 guidance that set an expectation for what high probability compliance meant and what processes BIS expects companies to have when faced with red flags. This guidance really hit hard on that point. It emphasized over and over and over again the view of the U.S. government that there's a high probability that the use of certain chips or chips that have certain capabilities or are built with certain technologies are being used for prohibited end uses, particularly in the People's Republic of China. Specifically, it highlighted WMD, which is really a catch-all for several of the catch-all provisions that relate to biological or chemical or nuclear weapons. There's also ballistic missile catch-alls. It also talked about, Brent, not necessarily the military catch-all provision, which is actually a bit more restricted to certain types of ECCNs, but the military intelligence, those two words connected by a hyphen, catch-all provision, which is extremely broad in that it is not limited to any particular ECCN. This is an example, Brent, of what we've been seeing, at least when you and I look around the corner, as item-based classifications become more and more cumbersome and really, I think it's fair to say, devolve into a game of whack-a-mole, just like listing entities and addresses on the entity list can, for example.
Absolutely.
Government and industry are going to be increasingly frustrated with those classifications, with industry saying, you said don't go 66, I'm going 65. Government saying, you know what, our interests aren't protected by a slightly slower hypersonic missile. That's still really bad. both industry and government might actually have an interest in stepping back from those as really the drivers and focusing instead on the end use and end user catch-all provisions, things like General Prohibition 10, that in some ways, I think the initial reaction is, oh no, that's a bigger burden because now I have to respond to red flags and I need to think about risk and managing risk. But first of all, you've always had to do that. These aren't new regulations. They invite you as a company, from that perspective, from the perspective of industry, to draw and defend your own lines about what you think high probability risk is and where it sits. That applies not only to particular transactions, but that helps you think about a defendable framework for answering the frequently asked question, how deep down my sales channel am I expected to go? And how do I defend the decision not to go down certain paths or to do certain things once I'm there? So, Brent, this guidance on May 13th, we thought was important in that it tracks with that bigger trend that we've been anticipating and seeing ourselves.
It's interesting, too, where you see the reference to WMDs and military intelligence. So that then triggers thinking about these catch-all provisions. The other interesting thing about these documents that came out of BIS were the reference to knowledge. That knowledge as defined under the EAR. We've been talking about this a long time. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding from some folks where they think knowledge is only actual knowledge. But no, it also includes an awareness of a high probability. We talked about the layers of knowledge in our last World ECR article on the glass onion. It's actually quite transparent all the way through. Now, when we're in this world of, look, you've got geopolitical rivalries, you've got shifting negotiation winds, shifting political winds. How can one stay grounded and not be whipsawed in here? It is leveraging that full definition of knowledge and understanding that and understanding these signals that are coming from the government, because that is really going to be the way to protect oneself and protect one's company when these shifts come. Because you say, well, look, we've got a high probability protocol. This is how we've implemented it through our compliance program. Now, again, I think, Mike, you make this point quite frequently too. We can't zero risk everything. We have to think about how we're going to take this risk-based approach, how we're going to identify and apply our high probability protocol in our trade compliance program. But the thing is, it's got to be there. It can't just be a zero, and it can't just be focused on the item classification, the technical parameters solely, because as we talk about, that's fighting the wrong game. It's like fighting the last battle, but now things have moved on. The whole world has moved on. The world of export controls, compliance, and enforcement has moved on. If one's still thinking about things from that item-based license requirement and not thinking really through about the end use and end users, then there is a risk of being whipsawed. The good news in all this is that it doesn't take that much. It just takes a little bit of mind shift, which then can open up a whole world of opportunities. This is also an opportunity for a new industry, government, public-private partnership in all this as well. It's a win-win.
Absolutely, Brent. One thing that comes to mind is that these catch-all provisions are not mutually exclusive. So even if certain items meet the technical requirements of certain ECCNs, it doesn't mean the others don't apply. The other thing to keep in mind about knowledge and why to be on the lookout for red flags of whatever stripe is that in addition to the catch-all provisions, we have seen already, Brent, in some of the enforcement actions that we talked about previously from this year, an emphasis on what white-collar lawyers typically call the inchoate offenses. These are found in the EAR in 764.2. They include things like aiding, abetting, conspiracy, evasion, acting with knowledge, which is a way to bootstrap knowledge onto even the strict liability offenses in the AR in terms of awareness. They also, Brent, include a prohibition on misrepresentations. If you become aware that your distributor or reseller might not have been truthful with you about whether or not they knew who the end user or what the end use was, that might also create difficulties under 764.2E, acting with knowledge for yourself, or General Prohibition 10. Acting with awareness of a past violation. We all know how it is. They might just be responding very quickly with what they think is the easiest answer. In a weird sense, what you want them to do is if they have concerns about the answer, to tell you that and then have a discussion with them about it. It'd be much better for you and them to work together if they know an end user and there's some concern about it than to later, after the fact, be confronted with pretty obvious evidence that the item was at least known by the distributor or reseller, and hopefully not, but maybe people on your own sales team to be going somewhere else.
Going on this theme of cutting through the noise, we've been taking different cuts through the noise. In our article where we talk about end-use certificates, specifically the insufficiency of end-use certificates alone, and the need for risk-based compliance that leverages the full definition of knowledge. Why don't we unpack that a little bit? Because that's also something coming up now. Licenses now have to be applied for and processed. And what are we having in there besides, an end-use certificate?
Well, Brent, in a document specifically called Industry Guidance to Prevent Diversion of Advanced Computing Integrated Circuits back on May 13th, 2025, the government identifies 11, quote, new transactional and behavioral red flags and 7 due diligence actions that companies should take for new customers, as well as for evaluating infrastructure as a service, or IaaS providers, those are data centers, involved with the export or use of advanced computing integrated circuits and or commodities that contain such integrated circuits. Well, you might be sitting there with this document in your hand thinking, what am I supposed to do with this? Maybe someone's asking you, what are we supposed to be doing with this? We think it's helpful to think about these new red flags and these due diligence actions, really not necessarily how they're organized in the document, but of 2 different types fundamentally. Some of these red flags and due diligence actions speak to things that you would typically see on an end use or end user statement. Just taking, for example, BIS's suggested form for end use and end user certifications. Some of these things about the name of the entity, the ultimate consignee, if different, the years of the relationship could speak directly to some of those new red flags and new due diligence actions raised. And BIS alludes in the guidance to the fact that they're not necessarily asking people to change their pre-existing end use and end user certificates. They're also not changing their own form as part of this. But some of these things, especially within the red flags suggested, go far beyond what you would normally get in any commonly used end user or end user certificate and go to, for example, the bona fides of the data center into which you're shipping these either integrated circuits or components, including them. As you've pointed out, Brent, when you're selling to a big data center, especially one that is on the leading edge of artificial intelligence capabilities, these are massive things. These are floor to ceiling machines. To borrow from the Supreme Court's definition of pornography, you know it when you see it, and you certainly know it when you see one of these. What you absolutely would be at risk of is what conversations did your engineers, your sales team have, either directly or indirectly, with the end user about what specifications they needed, including what power they were able to supply to the data center, all those things like that. Those are some of the types of red flags mentioned here. You wouldn't necessarily include that in the end user statement on this one-page form. You would need to think creatively and work with your colleagues in sales, frankly, and in engineering to figure out, well, where would we draw the lines where we would know that we're going into something like that? We've seen all kinds of media reports about pop-up data centers in Malaysia, or data centers that may not have even been pop-up ones, but still get stripped down for the components at some point anyway. There may be some limits to what private companies can do in order to police this, but the guidance that BIS issues is BIS signaling to industry, here's how we think of risk, here's where we draw that high probability line. You can make your own determination about that, but be prepared to defend it if it's different than ours.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of being able to defend it, this emphasis on the catch-all provisions and the full definition of knowledge is going to allow the government to bring more cases and resolve them faster with potentially a lot higher penalties than ever before. This ups the game for everyone.
So Brent, what about this 50% rule that everyone's talking about? What we write about in the article on that topic is don't be overly excited about this new rule. First of all, this rule doesn't change anything about the inchoate provisions of the EAR that we just talked about. Those are the anti-evasion provisions, aiding, abetting, conspiring, misrepresentation of facts, concealment, acting with knowledge. If you could be seen by the U.S. government as being aware of a high probability that shipment to a subsidiary was really an attempt to evade restrictions on a listed entity, even a 49% subsidiary, you're going to be challenged on that. You need to be prepared to defend yourself. There's nothing about any of those provisions that turns on whether something is 49% owned or 80% owned.
Even much less than 49%. Shell companies can have just nominees there. The issue on shell companies is not an issue of shareholding. It's an issue of control.
Absolutely. The issue on malign actors, political parties, military intelligence actors is that they don't necessarily even need shareholdings in order to exercise control or influence over what's happening. It doesn't mean every company has to spend billions of dollars on due diligence tools, but don't take too much comfort in the shareholding. If there is a 50% rule announced for the entity list, think of it very matter-of-factly as a 50% rule announced for the entity list. The entity list is a backstop, as we've called it before. It's adding a lot more entities to the backstop. If you have commercially available KYC, KYS tools, it's likely that those already were identifying for you, at least where their databases allowed them to, where there already was some known affiliations between these listed entities, whether it was 70%, 80%, or 20%. Frankly, that may raise questions going forward. If you did business with a subsidiary or affiliate of a listed entity before, what types of controls did you have in place to get comfortable? What kind of due diligence did you do to get comfortable that that didn't carry a high probability of evasion, of a violation of the EAR?
Look, a 50% rule wouldn't impose any more burden than what is already in existence under the EAR when you're looking at risk through that perspective of knowledge, which includes a high probability awareness. That is always there. So this is nothing new. The entity list is just a backstop. The most risky partners out there are not necessarily the ones that are on the entity list or would be 50% subsidiaries on the entity list. The most risky potential business partners are the ones that are not on a list. It's important to look at how did they get on the company's radar? Where did they come from? What were they asking for? What was the timing behind it? What are the facts and circumstances around that? Companies know their business and customers. You're going to vet your customers because you want the good leads. You want the Glenn Gary leads. You don't want the dogs out there that are not going to pay you or they're going to try to take your stuff. You want long-term commercial relationships that you can build businesses with and help your customers grow. These are the good customers out there. As a company doing your due diligence, that's all part of it.
Brent, even today, the fact that something is not on the entity list is not some kind of exception to any of the catch-all provisions, to General Prohibition 10, to any other part of the EAR. The reality is if you're a smuggler looking to divert products illegally to yourself or to your stakeholders, you're not going to do that through an entity that's on this list anyway. It doesn't feel this way to people who have to deal with this day to day. I totally get that. But I think that the government might be looking at the entity list as a tool that is actually meant to just make a decision easier for people because there is no decision to make. It's a strict liability offense, including regarding of what are you aware when you ship. So people are right to be worried about any change. This will significantly increase the number of entities that are subject to that automatic backstop. One way to deal with that is, again, to not focus necessarily on that. Let the tool do that for you automatically, but to focus your thinking, focus your judgment, focus the exercise of your professional judgment on where am I aware of red flags? Where does knowledge matter? Catch-all provisions, General Prohibition 10. Can I defend where we're drawing the line between relying on form-based self-certifications and where are we relying on something else? Even if above that line, just because of the overwhelming amount of global trade still today that's happening, you have to do some kind of informed sampling exercise or something like that. Instead of lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, overwhelmed with yet another task that's been put on your plate, work with your leadership, work with your management to right size what you do based on the time you have in a normal working day and that's healthy for you. Draw that line where it works for you and then defend it by thinking and documenting your thinking about high probability. You've referred, Brent, to a high probability protocol. That's exactly what we have in mind here. Is it ever going to be perfect? Is it ever going to be zero risk? It's never going to be. Now, if someone tells you that they have a zero risk program, they're missing everything because only if you touch things superficially are you going to think you haven't found anything.
That's right.
So we're all human. We're all trying to survive. We're all trying to get through this together. Use the high probability standard to your advantage. This is a relatively new point of emphasis. That's always concerning. The government is never reducing burdens. They're never taking away requirements. And honestly, in this geopolitical environment, expect more, not less. But use the tools creatively to your advantage where you can do so while still doing your best to promote security of ourselves, of our countries, and to reduce situations where you or your company get wrapped around the axle of an ever-changing and highly volatile geopolitical context.
Mike, why don't we walk through the three key takeaways that we put at the end of our article under the section of what to do. We've been talking about it for a bit, but why don't we sort of pull these together? Number one is take the national security reasons articulated by BIS seriously and understand that these may trigger catch-all provisions in the EAR. It's not just about technological thresholds, but also, and increasingly important, its end use and end user requirements. Think about that. When we're looking at the license requirements for any products, before even getting to item classification and pulling out our hair in terms of whether we're getting the classification right or not, looking first, would there be or could there be potential catch-all provisions that apply to end use and end user that would trigger a license application requirement even before we get into the technical details of the ECCNs? That's one thing to think about. Take these national security reasons seriously. They're real. We're living in this geopolitical world of rivalries and shifting sands. This is sort of like Game of Thrones. Things could change tomorrow. Things could change next week. Be ready for that.
It's not even just take it seriously. It's recognize it's not your call to make. Whether something is a national security concern is really squarely, uniquely a decision for the U.S. government to make. Now, the views of the United States government about national security risks are not monolithic. Lots of people who've devoted their lives to identifying, assessing, and trying to mitigate national security risk disagree about what those national security risks are and what to do about them. We try our best as a country to have a discussion about what those risks are and to try to at least agree on information where we have it. The U.S. government has information, obviously, that we don't and that our listeners don't, or maybe some of our listeners do. If you look at court decisions challenging U.S. authorities in some of these areas, particularly export controls, the national security issue is for the government. If you don't agree with the national security concerns identified, that's not a license to just dismiss those concerns. Engage with the government. Engage with BIS. If you have information or evidence that suggests that maybe they're wrong, that's really important, especially if you have information or evidence that you truly believe demonstrates that the end use and end user of your item is not raising these concerns. Absolutely make sure that you're documenting that and, frankly, having it readily available if you're challenged on that.
Let's move to takeaway number 2. So this is reassess your risk exposure to BIS by leveraging the full definition of knowledge that includes an awareness of a high probability. And to do this, develop and implement, if you haven't done already, or you haven't updated in a while, a high probability protocol to be able to defend the risk-based decisions in your export controls program and KYC, know your customer due diligence procedures. We've talked about this a bit, but I think it's worth saying it again because this is where the rubber meets the road.
Know thyself is the theme that we highlighted in one of our prior Fresh Looks articles on risk assessments. If you go back to look at our prior podcasts and our articles about directors' obligations in particular and directors' duties of oversight that also extend to C-suite executive managers, it's not enough in the current environment to just say, hey, I've read this article in Financial Times or New York Times or Reuters, Wall Street Journal, Dow Jones Risk Journal, World ECR, whatever it may be, all of your favorite publications, Export Compliance Daily, don't want to leave them out either. Are we covering this? And someone says, yes. And then that's the end of the discussion. The board and management both, to protect themselves, would benefit from having a meeting on this topic with an agenda that clearly references how are we addressing high probability enforcement risk in the current geopolitical climate, and then actually having a discussion. And when the person leans forward and says, yes, whether it's the board, whether it's the C-suite, they should say, I'm very glad to hear that. Tell me how. Show me how and where this particular aspect of enforcement risk is being reflected in how we are identifying and assessing risk from our perspective.
It's like the Missouri state motto, show me.
Exactly. So Brent, what was point number 3?
Our last takeaway in the article is take corrective action now to update your export controls compliance program before you've got government enforcement officials showing up at the door. BIS is quite active with outreach visits and administrative subpoenas. As we talked about in an earlier article, be careful how you handle that because you don't want to kick a hornet's nest.
As you said recently, Brent, knowledge is coming, and it's something that people need to anticipate. In any area of corporate regulation, whether it's export controls, whether it's antitrust, whether it's environmental, whether it's anti-corruption, it is always much, much better to be proactive in identifying your risks and deciding how you want to address those risks than being in a situation where a regulator is all over you with their own views of how you should have been doing that to begin with. It's much, much better to be in the driver's seat and have the time to be deliberative, to be thoughtful, to make sure that all the stakeholders who have relevant information have been consulted, again, including sales, maybe it's finance, logistics, customer service, wherever that data might be, making sure that that's all baked into part of this. This doesn't mean that this is an exercise that goes on for 12 months and 1,000 people are interviewed or things like that, but taking the time now before there's a knock on the door to be comfortable with your own assessment of risks in a way you're very comfortable defending if asked later is invaluable. It's much, much, much cheaper and much, much, much more efficient to be proactive than to be reactive, where you're going to get questions from the regulator that you will have to answer, where the regulator will do things or might threaten to do things that you have to respond to while trying to do the same exercise in parallel to all that. That can be extremely challenging.
Companies are now, and this goes back to the title of our article, facing a moment of truth. Under these new and increasing geopolitical pressures, the export compliance programs are facing this moment of truth in terms of their effectiveness and integrity to be able to withstand these pressures, these geopolitical pressures and vicissitudes. Now's the time to stand up and take the bull by the horns. The companies that understand how the export controls world has shifted and know how to operate effectively under the new rules of the game are going to have a competitive advantage over those companies, their competitors, who do not.
Well, Brent, I think that brings us to the back by ever-increasing popular demand segment, Brent Carlson's Managing Up. Brent, what is your managing up tip for the day?
The devil is in the details. Now, those details may prove much more simple than you would have thought or imagined. And the devil may be hiding in plain sight. Where people say, oh, it's complex, export controls are complex. Any system is complex. The devil's in the details, but you got to be focused on the right details. This is like, in Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, they're digging in the wrong place. Don't dig in the wrong place, dig in the right place. This is the essence of the risk-based approach. We're not going to zero risk everything.
Well said, Brent. Think big picture. What is the type of headline case that the Department of Justice, that the Department of Commerce would love to announce? It is something that's so obvious and so big that everyone will say, oh gosh, how could X company have missed that? Or how could they possibly have thought that was okay? Now, it's difficult to predict the future, but what are those types of things? It's things that jump off the page when you look at your trade flows holistically and dynamically. It's a theme we keep hitting on because we do think it's the only way to stay sane. Look at important dates in time. And frankly, just in the last couple months, the government has taken a few actions at key dates that will present data mining opportunities for everybody listening. What happened before something was banned, what happened when it was banned, what happened when it was unbanned, what happened when new guidance came out, when the entity list rule comes out, assuming that it does at some point, whatever it says, what changes right away. So look for changes in customers, look for changes in trade flows around key events. Those are the types of things that are going to be the easiest from the government's perspective for the government to prove up. And those are the ones that you want to be in a good position to defend if you did risk-based due diligence and found, well, actually, it's okay. Well, Brent, I think that concludes this episode of Red Flags Rising. As always, it was a pleasure. Lots of news to come, I'm sure, in the coming weeks. Stay tuned, and we'll keep everyone updated right here on Red Flags Rising. Brent, be well.
Thanks, Mike. Be well. And to everyone else out there, be well. We're all in this together.